According to UN statistics, the number of people living in urban areas has surpassed that of rural areas, and we are all a part of this trend. Given that what is considered urban varies by country, the term is actually quite difficult to define. Some nations base their definition on population size or population density, while others take into account the type of employment the locals have or the development of the infrastructure. Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Angela Iran. Together with me in this presentation is Ms. Norsali Hamito, and we are to discuss urbanization and rural-urban migration. In this chapter, we focus on one of the most complex and nuanced dilemmas of the development process, the phenomenon of massive and historically unprecedented movements of people from the rural countryside to the burgeoning cities in the world. Before we delve into this topic, let us first define these two significant words. Migration. It is defined as the movement from one country, place, or locality to another. Imagine your family leaving your residence to permanently reside in a much more urban place, or let's say in the city. No matter what reasons your family has, this is called migration. Migration can be permanent, temporary, or seasonal, and this phenomenon happens for a range of reasons, and these possible reasons will be discussed in a little while. Urbanization, on the other hand, is defined as the process by which large numbers of people become permanently concentrated in relatively small areas forming cities. We can infer from their definitions that there is a strong correlation between these two, and we will attempt to analyze it in this presentation. Another important term to consider is rural-urban migration, and it is defined as the movement of people from rural villages, towns, and farms to urban centers or cities in search of jobs. However, as I previously stated, there are still additional possible causes or reasons for migration aside from the pursuit of employment. The positive association between urbanization and per capita income is one of the most apparent and striking stylized facts of the development process, because generally, the more developed the country, measured by per capita income, the greater the share of the population living in urban areas. In other words, the countries with high incomes tend to be the most urbanized, whereas the nations with the lowest incomes tend to be the least urbanized. Due to massively increased population, cities in most developing nations are experiencing unprecedented inflows of people. The very large individual city sizes at such low levels of per capita income are also unparalleled. The biggest cities in developed countries were much smaller in the past than the biggest cities in developing countries are now. This just serves to highlight how quick population growth and urbanization have become in recent years. For the period 2005 to 2030, the UN projects that the world population will grow at a 1.78% average annual rate. Accordingly, there will be almost 5 billion urban dwellers by 2030, nearly 5/8 of the projected 8.1 billion world population in that year. In fact, after 2015, the number of people living in rural areas in the world is projected to actually begin to decrease by some 155 million people from 2015 to 2030, or an annual rate of negative 0.32%. The most rapid urbanization is now occurring in Asia and Africa. Well before 2030, more than half of all people in these regions will live in urban areas. Now the central question related to the unprecedented size of these urban agglomerations is how these cities will cope on economic, environmental, and political levels with such severe concentrations of people. Now let us talk about one of the dilemmas of migration and urbanization, which is urban bias. Urban bias is the notion that most governments in developing countries favor the urban sector in their development policies, thereby creating a widening gap between the urban and rural economies. Some nations tend to give greater importance to urban sectors because these are the areas that they believe to have a great contribution to economic development. However, this just makes more rural economies underdeveloped compared to the urban areas. So, what happens is that rural economies become stagnant and urban places become more developed, to the extent that a lot of people would decide to migrate in urban areas because of the opportunities and better living that they perceive to get there. And because of increased migration, the population in urban areas becomes swollen. So that is why urban bias is a dilemma of migration and urbanization.
Today, more than half of all people in the world live in an urban area. By mid-century, this will increase to 70%. But as recently as 100 years ago, only 2 out of 10 people lived in a city, and before that, it was even less. How have we reached such a high degree of urbanization, and what does it mean for our future? In the earliest days of human history, humans were hunter-gatherers, often moving from place to place in search of food. But about 10,000 years ago, our ancestors began to learn the secrets of selective breeding and early agricultural techniques. For the first time, people could raise food rather than search for it, and this led to the development of semi-permanent villages for the first time in history. Why only semi-permanent, you might ask? Well, at first the villages still had to relocate every few years as the soil became depleted. It was only with the advent of techniques like irrigation and soil tilling about 5,000 years ago that people could rely on a steady and long-term supply of food, making permanent settlements possible. And with the food surpluses that these techniques produced, it was no longer necessary for everyone to farm. This allowed the development of other specialized trades and, by extension, cities. With cities now producing surplus food as well as tools, crafts, and other goods, there was now the possibility of commerce and interaction over longer distances. And as trade flourished, so did technologies that facilitated it, like carts, ships, roads, and ports. Of course, these things required even more labor to build and maintain, so more people were drawn from the countryside to the cities as more jobs and opportunities became available. If you think modern cities are overcrowded, you may be surprised to learn that some cities in 2000 BC had population densities nearly twice as high as that of Shanghai or Calcutta. One reason for this was that transportation was not widely available, so everything had to be within walking distance, including the few sources of clean water that existed then. And the land area of the city was further restricted by the need for walls to defend against attacks. The Roman Empire was able to develop infrastructure to overcome these limitations. But other than that, modern cities as we know them didn't really get their start until the Industrial Revolution, when new technology deployed on a mass scale allowed cities to expand and integrate further, establishing police, fire, and sanitation departments, as well as road networks and later electricity distribution. So what is the future of cities? Global population is currently more than 7 billion and is predicted to top out around 10 billion. Most of this growth will occur in the urban areas of the world's poorest countries. So how will cities need to change to accommodate this growth? First, the world will need to seek ways to provide adequate food, sanitation, and education for all people. Second, growth will need to happen in a way that does not damage the land that provides us with the goods and services that support the human population. Food production might move to vertical farms and skyscrapers, rooftop gardens, or vacant lots in city centers, while power will increasingly come from multiple sources of renewable energy. Instead of single-family homes, more residences will be built vertically. We may see buildings that contain everything that people need for their daily life, as well as smaller, self-sufficient cities focused on local and sustainable production. The future is valuable and creative, no longer built around a single industry, but reflecting an increasingly connected and global world.
The role of cities. The role of cities provide consumers with more choices of goods and services. Cities are the agents of social, cultural, economic, technological, and political changes and advancement. The advantage of urbanization economies can be reflected in a large, functional urban regions. Cities play an important role in economic development, for it provides efficient infrastructure and services through density and concentration in transportation, communications, power, human interactions, water, and sanitation services. To a large degree, cities are formed because they provide cost advantages to producers and consumers through what we call agglomeration economies. The term agglomeration is an economic term used to refer to the phenomenon of firms being located close to one another. So we have two forms of agglomeration economies. First, we have the urbanization economies, and second, we have the localization economies. When we say urbanization economies, these are effects associated with the general growth of the concentrated geographic region, and localization economies are effects captured by a particular sectors of the economy, such as finance or automobiles, as they grow within an area. Urbanization economies arise when the size of the city leads to an increase in productivity, while localization economies occur when an increase in the size of an industry in a city leads to an increase in productivity of a particular activity. The difference between them is that localization economies are economies external to the firm but internal to the industry, and urbanization economies are external to the firm and to the industry but internal to the city. So let's go to industrial district. Industrial district is a social territorial entity which is characterized by the active presence of both community of people and a population firms in one naturally and historically bounded area. An economic definition of a city is an area with relatively high population density that contains a set of closely related activities. Firms frequently prefer to be located in areas where they can learn from other companies doing similar work. Learning occurs in both formal relationships, such as joint ventures, and informal relationships. Informal ones, such as those obtained from evening social clubs or over lunch. Firms based in this industrial district also benefit from the ability to subcontract work. When unusual large order arrives, it is simple. As a result, a small business, an arrangement means that does not have to turn down a large job due to a lack of capacity that allows for flexible specialization. It may not matter as much such industrial districts are located as they somehow got an early start there, perhaps because of a historical accident. For example, in United States, many innovative computer firms located in Silicon Valley, California, simply because other such firms were already located there. Now let's go to social capital. Social capital refers to the institutions, relationships, and norms that shape the quality and quantity of a society's social interactions. Increasing evidence shows that social cohesion is critical for societies to prosper economically and for development to be sustainable. Social capital is also critical, especially group trust and a shared history of successful collective action, which requires time to develop. Government can help by bringing parties together and helping them gain experience in cooperating on more modest goals before tackling the larger ones. But social capital normally grows organically in an economic community and cannot be created by fiat. Even with collective action to supplement passive benefits of agglomeration, traditional clusters may not survive in their current form into more advanced stages of industrialization. Next, we have the efficient urban scale. Urban scale is said to be economically efficient if average costs for industries are lowest. An increase in urban density leads to congestion cost. Localization economies do not imply that it would be efficient for all of country's industry to be located together in a single city. These economies extend across closely related industries such as those with a strong background and a forward linkage, but there are fewer productivity benefits for unrelated industry to locate together. One notable exemption is the potential spillover from technological progress in one industry to its adaptation for different uses in another industry. But there are also some important congestion costs. The higher the urban density, the higher the cost of real estate. It is much more expensive to build vertically than horizontally. So as skyscraper scale is reached, so that when market forces work properly, tall buildings are built primarily when urban and costs become high. Economists commonly define congestion as the presence of interactions between vehicles on the road. In effect, all loads that carry significant traffic volumes have some level of congestion. Congestion is a market situation where the demand to buy an asset or trading instrument is matched by the seller's supply. This results in the price not moving significantly, making the price action consolidated or look congested. Let's proceed to the urban giantism problem. Urban giantism is an economic situation where the government considers providing more financial support and development activities in larger cities. The causes of urban giantism include the location of the national capital to the largest city and usage of the hub and spoke transportation system. When the government locates national capital to facilitate larger cities activities, other local markets within its premises experience low development growth, which affects the economic growth of the state. Hub and spoke transportation means that the several vehicles within a state are controlled by a central transportation company, mainly located in large urban center. Further, hub and spoke transportation systems lead to an increment of transportation costs for small cities. Next, we have the first city bias, a form of urban bias that has often caused considerable distortions might be termed first city bias. The country's largest or first city receive a disproportionately large share of public investment and incentives for private investment in relation to the country's second largest city and other smaller cities. As a result, the first city receives disproportionately and inefficiently large share of population and economic activity. The table shows that the largest and second largest cities in the United States, Canada, and major Latin American countries. Notice that in all of the outside capital cities, Buenos Aires, Santiago, Mexico City, and Lima, the first city also served as the capital. Some other developing countries have remarkable outside first cities, notably Thailand, where Bangkok has a population about 20 times the size of the second city. Further examples can be found in the Philippines, where Manila has over 7 times the population of the second city. Now let's proceed to the causes of urban giantism. Urban giantism probably results from a combination of a hub and a spoke transportation system, and the location of the political capital in the largest city. This is further reinforced by a political culture of rent-seeking and the capital market failures that make the creation of a new urban centers task that markets cannot complete. Another explanation for urban giants focuses on the consequence of dictators' efforts to remain in power. As the table shows, on average, a much larger share of countries' urbanized population, 37%, lives in the first city is unstable dictatorship than in stable democracies, which is 23%. In interpreting this finding, Alberto Ates and the Edward Glacier argued that the unstable dictatorship or the fearing overthrow must provide breed and circuses for the first city, which is usually the capital, to prevent unrest. This extreme urban bias in turn attracts more migrants to the favored city and still larger need for breed and circuses. It should be noted that although the authors attempt to control for reverse causality, it may still be the case that unstable dictatorship also tend to emerge in countries with high first city. The informal sector is part of the urban economy of developing countries, characterized by the small competitive individual or family firms, petty retail, trade and services, labor-intensive method, free entry and market-determined factor and product prices. The urban informal sector can be defined only as the residual difference between total national economic activity and the well-recorded activity of the formal sector. The existence of unrecognized, unorganized, unregulated, and mostly legal but not registered informal sector was recognized in 1970s. The following observations in several developing countries that massive additions to the urban labor force failed to show up informal modern sector employment statistic. The new entrants to the urban labor force seem to create their own employment or to work for small-scale or family-owned enterprises. Figure 7.9 shows the relative importance of informal unemployment in selected cities. Most of these cities reflect the typical range of informal sector employment share from about 30% to 70%. We find a similar pattern of high informal sector employment in cities throughout the developing world. For example, in India, the urban informal sector comprises 28.5% of employment in Kolkata and 46.5% in Ahmedabad and the rest. Policies for the urban informal sector. In terms of its relationship with the other sectors, the informal sector is linked with the rural sector in that it allows excess labor to escape from extreme rural poverty and underemployment, although under living and working conditions and for incomes that are often not much better. It is closely connected with the formal urban sector. The formal sector depends on the informal sector for cheap inputs and wage goods for its workers, and the informal sector in turn depends on the growth of the formal sector for a good portion of its income and clientele. The informal sector has demonstrated its ability to generate employment and income for the urban labor force. As pointed out earlier, it is already absorbing average of 50% of the urban labor force. Some studies have shown the informal sector generating almost one-third of the urban income. Women in the informal sector. In some regions of the world, women predominate among the rural-urban migrants and may even comprises the majority of the urban population, though historically many of these women are simply accompanying their spouses. A growing number of women in Latin America, Asia, and Africa migrate to seek economic opportunity. Urban women supposedly enjoy greater social, economic, political opportunities and freedoms than their rural counterparts. However, the notable gender gaps in labor and employment, decent work, pay, rights, access to the accumulation of assets and personal securities and safety, and representation in informal structures of urban governance show that women are often the last to benefit from the prosperity of cities.
As noted earlier, rural-urban migration has been dramatic, and urban development plays an important role in economic development. But what is actually happening? Rates of rural urban migration in developing countries have exceeded rates of urban job creation, and as a result, it greatly surpassed the absorption capacity of both industry and urban social services. So migration worsens rural urban structural imbalances in two direct ways. First, on the supply side. Due to the high proportion of well-educated young adults in the migrant system, internal migration disproportionately accelerates the growth rate of urban job seekers in comparison to urban population growth, which has reached historically unprecedented levels. The presence of urban job seekers tends to swell the urban labor supply while depleting the rural countryside of valuable human capital. So, this is apparent in our country. Just for an instance, a lot of graduates here in Daet seek job opportunities in Manila, and because of their desire to find a job in the city, we here in our municipality tend to lack human capital. And in turn, the population of job seekers in the city grows severely. The second is on the demand side. Urban job creation is generally more difficult and costly to accomplish than rural job creation because of the need for substantial complementary resource inputs for most jobs in the industrial sector. Migration in excess of job opportunities is both a symptom of and a contributor to underdevelopment. This is because when urban areas become swollen with immigrants seeking urban jobs, valuable human capital in rural areas depletes. And also, because of the excess job opportunities and the increasing rate of urban dwellers aiming to find a job, there comes a surplus in labor supply, but eventually, there also comes a lagging demand in labor. A simple yet crucial step in underlining the centrality of the migration phenomenon is to recognize that any economic and social policy that affects rural and urban real incomes will directly or indirectly influence the migration process. Because all economic policies have direct and indirect effects on the level and growth of urban or rural incomes or both, they all will have a tendency to influence the nature and magnitude of the migration stream. In addition, we need to understand better not only why people move and what factors are most important in their decision making process, but also what the consequences of migration are for rural and urban economic and social development. We have already defined what rural urban migration is. Again, it is the movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. So, this is said to be the most important type of migration from the perspective of long run development. It is for this reason that the population share of the cities is growing, despite the fact that fertility is much lower in urban areas. And the difference is accounted for by rural urban migration. It is also important because of the potential development benefits of economic activity of cities due to agglomeration, economies, and other factors. Now let us move on to the possible causes of migration. So, what are the factors or things that affect or amplify the migration phenomenon? First on the list is wage differentials. We all know that the minimum wage here in the province is lower than what's in the city. So people perceive migration as an opportunity to have better salaries or wages. From a global perspective, some Filipinos decide to migrate to other countries, such as the United States, Canada, or Japan, because they believe that the compensation in those countries is obviously much higher, which is true. However, it is still important that people will not just focus on the salary that they will get from a certain place, but also on the living expenses that they would incur there. Next on the list is age. Some people may decide to move to another place or country and leave the place where they grew up. It might be that a person has reached the age where he or she wants to go out of his or her comfort zone and wants to explore the world. Some instances could also be that adults or elderly people living in urban areas may want to go back to the countryside. Another possible cause of migration is education. Higher education is one of the top reasons people immigrate, especially the younger ones. To pursue higher education in a field that is not available in their country or at a better university that is available abroad. In addition to wage differentials, age, and education, migration is also explained partly by relocation upon marrying, prior emigration of family members, distance and costs of relocation, occurrence of famine, disease, violence, and other disasters, and relative standing in the origin community, with those lower on the social order more likely to migrate. Migration can also be a form of portfolio diversification for families who seek to settle some members in areas where they may not be affected by economic shocks like if they had stayed at home. The overwhelming evidence of the past several decades when developing nations witnessed a massive migration of their rural populations into urban areas, despite rising levels of urban unemployment and underemployment, became inadequately explained by the existing theories about urbanization and industrialization. So, one theory to explain the apparently paradoxical relationship of accelerated rural urban migration in the context of rising urban unemployment has come to be known as the Todaro migration model and in its equilibrium form as the Harris-Todaro model. Todaro migration model is a theory that explains rural urban migration as an economically rational process despite high urban unemployment. Starting from the assumption that migration is primarily an economic phenomenon, which for the individual migrant can be a quite rational decision despite the existence of urban unemployment, the Todaro model postulates that migration proceeds in response to urban-rural differences in expected income rather than actual earnings. So, based on the Todaro migration model, migrants calculate urban expected income, and these migrants move if the expected income in urban exceeds the average rural income. So, the fundamental premise of this model is that migrants consider the various labor market opportunities available to them in the rural and urban sectors, and they choose the one that maximizes their expected gains from migration. To sum up, the Todaro migration model has four basic characteristics. The first one is that migration is driven primarily by rational economic considerations such as fringe benefits and costs, mostly financial but also psychological. Second characteristic is that the decision to migrate is determined by the interaction of two variables: the actual difference in wages in the rural and urban areas, and the probability of obtaining employment in the urban sector. The third characteristic is the probability of obtaining an urban job is directly related to the urban employment rate and thus inversely related to the urban unemployment rate. So, in simple terms, when there is a high rate of urban employment, there is also a high probability of obtaining an urban job. And if the urban unemployment rate is high, the probability of getting an urban job is low. And the fourth characteristic is that migration rates in excess of urban job opportunity growth rates are not only possible, but also rational and even likely in the face of wide urban-rural expected income differentials. Therefore, the disproportionate status of economic opportunities in rural and urban areas in countries that are underdeveloped causes high rates of urban unemployment.
Migration is a global phenomenon that touches us all. Many of us know someone who has moved to another country or have migrated ourselves. By embracing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we have an unmissable opportunity to harness the development potential of migration, to support beneficial outcomes, starting with reducing inequalities and putting the right policies in place to ensure safer, more orderly and regular migration. Migration has been a long-standing coping strategy for people to pull themselves out of poverty, to cope with lack of basic infrastructure or search for better opportunities. People's reasons to move can also be influenced by conflict, natural hazards, or environmental conditions linked to climate change. And in a global context of rapid urbanization, movement of people is increasingly taking place to cities and urban areas, enriching local communities and societies, both where migrants are and where they come from. The knowledge, skills and experience that migrants bring and gain in new places contribute to the labour force in key sectors such as health, and play a vital role in building diverse and productive societies. Migration can empower women economically and socially and help people realise their personal aspirations and educational potential. This encourages innovation, which benefits science, technology and industry. With increased earnings, migrants are able to send financial support to family members back home. This is critical to help reduce hunger and strengthen the resilience and sustainability of poorer communities. But none of these benefits are guaranteed. We can only achieve all of this by upholding human rights, fostering peace and security, ensuring equal access to justice and protection from exploitation for all. We also need to build strong partnerships in our cities, within our countries and regions, and globally through international cooperation. Migration is everyone's business. Together, we can ensure that we leave no one behind.